So I'm going to open up from just reading a section from Proverbs 4, and we'll kind of dive off of that from there. Proverbs 4:18 says this, "The path of the righteous is like the morning sun, shining ever brighter till the full light of day. But the way of the wicked is like deep darkness. They do not know what makes them stumble. My son, pay attention to what I say. Turn your ear to my words. Do not let them out of your sight. Keep them within your heart, for they are life to those who find them and health to one's whole body. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." Or some translations absolutely say, "For guard your heart, for from it is the wellspring of life," which does absolutely tie into our church's name, which this idea that a wellspring is a source of continual supply, which is the Holy Spirit, which is the Spirit, and that also then, when you become a believer, resides inside of you, and you are filled with the Spirit, and there's this wellspring of life, so you guard that heart because of that. Streams of living water flow from you, and we need to guard our hearts from that. So I want to open up from jumping off this text and this conversation about trusting the words of God and trusting the ways that he's promised for us, and just ask ourselves the question tonight: how are you doing? Just take a moment and really ask yourself right now, tonight, how are you? It's a question we get all the time, but how honestly do we take the time to stop and assess and just look at the state of our own souls and our hearts and ask ourselves, how am I doing? Typically, when I get that question, right, we answer pretty shortly. It's something like, "Oh, I'm doing pretty great," or "I'm fine," or "I'm exhausted," or "I'm busy." And then we go on with our day with the tasks that we have at hand. And I think there's like this drive that's pushing us through the day that we just kind of need to keep clipping along and do what we need to do. And it's not all bad, because we have these desires. We have these longings that are in our heart. And it seems like any of us, I don't know if you're all on this pursuit, that we've never quite reached or attained those desires that we're longing for. And I think that's okay, because the Bible says eternity is inside the heart of all mankind. Right? We were created for eternity, but that eternity is only fully satiated when you are with Christ in heaven, full unity, full communion with him, and therefore we never quite taste, we never quite grasp what we are longing for in this life. And therefore, because of that, we are constantly on this grind, and we're constantly running after these desires unless we take a moment to stop and assess, which usually we don't do, and stop and assess the state of our own soul until something breaks down, like till something's broken or something really hurts. And then we're like, "Oh man, actually something's wrong here." So for example, my car, it's parked right out here. It died recently, but I had no idea until, of course, I got into the car and I tried to start it and it wouldn't start. So then I had to pop the hood and figure out what was going on. But I'll tell you, I don't remember the last time I popped that hood. Like, it's probably years since I've ever done anything with that, and I didn't even pay attention to it until the car wouldn't start anymore. The same is true so often with the state of our souls if we don't take the time to stop and assess and ask ourselves that question: how are we doing? And I think in the midst of life, as we're pursuing these questions or not actually letting ourselves dive in and take that time to rest and stop, we get this restlessness in our spirit. We get this desire for more that we're all craving, like we talked about, and we're longing for a break. Now, I think for some of us, it's like twofold on that word break to play on that. Like, some of us are just longing for a break, as in we could really just use a break. Like, I really need a place that has a hammock and a drink that's made out of a coconut with a little umbrella or something like that. That would be really nice right now. But also other of us are like, really, no, like an afternoon off, and if I could just like switch off the lights and just have the afternoon to myself, that would be wonderful in and of itself. Or some of us, like, it's a break, it's as in a breakthrough, as in there's a breakthrough we are longing for, some experience that we have not yet had, or some experience that we are longing to achieve, whether it's in the workplace or in relationships. But regardless, there's a sense of restlessness till we hit that place, because again, we're longing for deep community with our Savior, yet none of us are fully in that place. And so here's just a few things statistically, right? Recent studies have said that some of the most common words used by individuals today for their state of self is the word overwhelmed. Overwhelmed is the word that most people would use to share their state of self. There's another study that says 1 out of every 3 people would label themselves as chronically overworked. The Wall Street Journal held a survey that found that over 40% of Americans, so not just New Yorkers, but Americans, say that lack of time is a bigger problem for them as opposed to lack of money. So actual lack of time, we're saying, hey, you can have a little bit more time in your day to get the things you need to get done, or you need a little bit more money. And people are like, no, I need more time in my life. And I think because of that, much of that lack of time and that overwork is because we're all seeking and chasing after our desires. And many of us are caught up in this myth or this lie that the wellspring of life, right, what we referred to in that text, is something that we can actually attain on our own today through our own efforts. And it's not by accident that we're all in this state of restlessness and chasing after this desire to overwork and to overachieve if you are living in that state where you think it is something that you can achieve on your own. So we'll do a throwback quote today to St. Augustine, who I think he says this so well when he talks about this longing in our heart. He says, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." Which is why I think the Christian faith is centered on relationship so much. That's why we talk so much in this church about the presence of God, because it's in the presence of God that we find that fullness, and that's where we find that true rest that we're all longing for, that we so often do not achieve in this world. And in direct opposition to this rest that we're talking about here is the state of brokenness of this world that the enemy longs to keep you trapped in. The core temptation from the very beginning of time. Remember this, right? Garden of Eden, that core temptation. The enemy wants you to believe that there is something else in this world, that there is something else to be achieved or tried or tasted that will actually satisfy you more than the ways that the Lord has told you would satisfy you. Right? It's actually kind of that same thing in that conversation. I've been studying this week. We talked a lot about finances last week and that spirit of mammon, where it's just like we're trying to trust in something other than God and what God has for ourselves. And in this way, it's our busyness or our desire to actually not trust that the way and the rhythm that God has established for us is the best way forward. And therefore, busyness or productivity in particular, right, just kind of like the byproduct of busyness, is actually seen as a virtue in the world today. Many of us, I think, actually lament the fact that we're so busy. That we don't like it. A lot of us would actually like to rest a lot more, and yet still somehow that busyness is seen as a virtue. I think part of it is because we don't really know another way to live. In fact, I found that if you're not busy, if you're not constantly going after something or doing something and people ask you about that, and you're truly just in a place of rest, that there's actually a subtle sense of shame that creeps into your life. And part of that, I think, is because I believe saying, "I'm so busy" is almost our culture's new acceptable way of saying, "I'm important." Right? And while work is good and it's beautiful, don't get me wrong on this. We often use it as a way to find our value and our worth in this world, and therefore we keep producing because that's what's valued in culture. And again, work is ordained by God. That's what I love about our Father, right? He created us in his own image, and he himself is a creator. We were created to work. So he elevates the value of work in this world. But at the same time, he also is a God of rest. So rest is also beautiful and important. So while he elevates work, he also elevates rest. We were made in the image of a God who established rest and delight from the very beginning as a core rhythm of humanity. Start with me, end of Genesis 1. It says, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. Right? He saw his creation. He was delighting in it. And there was evening, and there was morning the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day, and he made it holy, which means set apart, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. And yet most of us never fully get to that place of rest and delight. Most of us never really experience, honestly, rest and rejuvenation and joy that God intends for us. And not just like every once in a while, but he longs for you to experience that weekly, even daily in your rhythms. And I think it's because we're caught up in that lie that we still need to do it in our own strength and in our own power. Or that we'll be, left behind by the busyness and the productivity of culture. That we don't trust fully that the way of God that he calls us to live is that pathway to freedom. It's that same lie that's just been seeded in from the enemy from the get-go. And this is one area in particular that I think Americans are terrible at, right? We're failing so hard in this area of rest. And it doesn't matter if they're Christians or if they're non-Christians. We all kind of are really terrible at rest. Right? We're really, really great workers in America. We're very productive. We're very successful. We are great at our jobs, and we're great at our side hustles, right? We're relentless workers, but we're terrible at resting. Here's a few other stats, right? Americans take less and shorter paid vacations than anyone else in the entire world. And on top of that, 20% of the people that actually take those vacations usually bring their phones, or 20% of them bring their phones and their computers along with them to stay in touch with their jobs while they're away. So forget about weekly rest and Sabbath. Even the few planned out vacations that we have are not fully times of restoration and rest. And when we don't learn to rest and restore and renew ourselves, we erode our impact. Right? We lessen our sustainability and our ability to tap into our very purpose of life, which is to be tethered to the vine. Remember, God says, I'm the vine and you are the branches. Remain in me, right? In that we hear his voice. That's where he gives us purpose. That's where we find that filling of our relationship with him. So remember, it's all about relationship with Christ. He wants to be with you, and the only way to be with someone and have a relationship with them is to spend some time with them. There's no other way around that. And so Christians really, in effect, should be leading the way on what a healthy lifestyle looks like, of what joy looks like, of what rejuvenation looks like, because we literally are in communion and relationship with the one who is called the joy giver. Yet we are often just as jaded and just as stressed out and just as weary as the next person. There's a Dr. Michael Zigarelli, an associate professor at Charleston Southern University. It's a school of business. And he did this large study, 5 years, 20,000 different Christians from age 15 to 88, 139 different countries. So this is global. And he titled it The Obstacles to Growth Survey. And in it, he revealed that while the Lord does tell us all that we're supposed to be salt and light in this world, we're not exactly standing out from the crowd, right? There's not much of a difference, he's saying, between Christians and non-Christians. And what he said, that largely what believers have said is that they admitted they're simply too busy for God. The summary of what he said was busyness is the primary barrier to Christians' intimacy with God. And so here I'll just roll through this cycle of 5 that he kind of noted that came up time and again in the study. He goes that Christians are assimilating to a culture of busyness, hurry, and overload, which then leads to God becoming more marginalized in these Christians' lives, which then leads to a deteriorating relationship with God, which leads to Christians becoming even more vulnerable to adopting secular assumptions about how to live, right? We all do this self-help books, how to do deeper levels of productivity, how to do best practices, all that, which then leads to more conformity to a culture of busyness, hurry, and overload, and the cycle begins again. Doesn't that sound familiar for any of you? Definitely sounds familiar to me. And it's just like that our busyness and our refusal to rest as a people is revealing this increasing gap between what we say is important in our hearts. Like if I asked us, what would we say is actually important, but then the way that we're actually living and spending our time. There's a theologian named Robert Barron, he argued this. He goes, at the heart of original sin is the refusal to accept God's rhythm for us. See, God set forth a rhythm for life is what we're saying, right? That plan of the enemy is to deceive you into believing that you don't need to follow that rhythm. Okay, so where we're going to go from here tonight, right, is we can just take an extra level of just kind of kicking back and relaxing because we're talking about rest here. So we're just going to walk through this idea of resting in the Lord because I think in it, as we read in Proverbs, it's just such great wisdom to be a people who can know and understand what does it mean to trust and walk in that rhythm of rest. Because as we said before, the Wall Street Journal claims that people feel like they need more time, that time scarcity is the reason we are living hectic lives. But I wonder if our hectic lives are not so much a matter or a product of a lack of time, but actually a lack of wisdom. Verse 19 in our text today, remember it says, but the way of the wicked is like deep darkness. They do not know what makes them stumble. You see, our incessant busyness keeps us from this life of wisdom, and therefore we're not plugged into the life source, which is Jesus. And then we trip and we fall and we stumble. We don't even know what does it because we don't take that time to stop and assess. If you're never in that place of resting, it's like you're walking in deep darkness, and you may be tripping up and you may be getting hurt, but you don't even have time to understand what's going on in the state of your soul and your heart to know what is tripping you up. I think God is calling out to us and giving us a solution for health here by saying, listen to my words, listen to Scripture, right? Do not let it out of your sight. Keep my words in your heart. They will give you life. I like how, you guys familiar with John Ortberg? He's another great writer and pastor, and he talks about this, how this concept of like what we're longing for, but actually how we're actually living. And he says most of us worry about the big things, right? The big decisions. Who am I going to marry? Where am I going to live? What am I going to do about my vocation, etc. But it's actually, in truth, not those large decisions, but the daily and the weekly and the monthly routines that drive our lives. Right? And it's those routines that if we don't pay attention to them and what we're doing with our daily life, that increases that gap between what we say matters most to us and how we're actually living our lives. I want to mention briefly this idea of sacrifice because I do believe there's an intentionality to this idea of rest as well. Right? And God talks about sacrifice in the Bible in terms of first fruits. And we talked about this last week a lot in terms of finances, of us giving the best to God, not just what's left over, but I also think there is something in this about our time and our attention. So like giving our best to God and our time and attention, it's just that same spirit, right? It's all tied in together here. And I think so often we don't rest and focus on God with our first fruits, and we give him just what's left over, if there's anything left over, right? We give the Lord what's left over after we've made it through our 80-hour work week here in the city, right? We give him what's left over after we've seen everything we wanted to see in Amazon Prime. We've given him what's left over after we've made sure our kids are all squared away and the chores in the house are all taken care of, at least to a good enough state, so that we can then rest. And truly, as I'm walking with people in the church and we're talking about this, I don't think it's so much that we're like not honoring the Sabbath and not resting out of a way of it being like defiance or intentional disobedience. I think for most of us, it's an addiction. It's like an addiction to busyness. We all know that we need rest. I think most of us would say, yeah, I need to unplug more, but our time just gets used up. So we sit down to take a break, but instead of resting, I do this all the time, right? I grab my phone, and I'm scrolling, and I'm working, and I'm on my phone. Or we intend to have a quiet night. We know it's coming up, but somehow our computers make their way out, and we're on these emails, or we're getting busy, and we're knocking out just a little bit more work. Or we're planning for this weekend that's coming up and to have some time off. But if you're honest, I know many of you end up rolling into Monday more exhausted after your quote-unquote relaxing weekend than you were before you entered into that weekend. How does that happen? And see, the truth is, as people, we were made for rest. In fact, it's not just that we were made for it. It is a command from Scripture to rest. It is a life of freedom and healing that God is promising us. And so therefore, he's saying you got to learn to rest. And as we were saying, it's not something that's just going to happen, clearly, right? That's not our default mode. Rest is a choice. Resting requires intentionality. I truly believe today, more than ever, resting and the idea to go to Sabbath, which we're going to talk about specifically, is a countercultural activity. And the reason I want to talk about Sabbath in particular, we could talk about daily rhythms of rest, even seasonal, like getting away or having retreats. That's all important stuff. But I think just as a baseline of what radical rest looks like in a city of productivity would just be to honor this idea of an intentional 24-hour period. I'm saying once a week, just like that creation rhythm that God intended, that you take a 24-hour period where you shut it down. Just shut it down and you dial into the Lord. Rest on a weekly basis. I love this guy, Dan Allender, great writer, and he puts it this way. He says, the choice to go to Sabbath in the face of uncertainty and struggle is the true war with Sabbath. We often fail to create a day of delight because to do so compels us to stand against the division, destitution, and despair that often holds us captive the other 6 days of the week. Okay, so Sabbath, right? And don't get, and I'll talk about this later, but don't get legalistic about the day, right? It's if it needs to be an actual day or if it needs to be like 5 o'clock on Saturday night to 5 o'clock on Sunday, establish that time, but make 24 hours. Pick a day and choose to go to Sabbath. The Hebrew word for Sabbath actually just means to cease, to stop working. And again, like we're saying, so many of us usually see this as an optional extra to have this day. But in fact, God makes it very clear that it's something that is essential to discipleship to Jesus. The call to living into this rhythm is throughout Scripture. So we establish at the creation mandate, right, that it's in the rhythm of creation. But obviously, the most obvious place that we see this is in the Ten Commandments. And it's right there listed in the Ten Commandments, inequality with other commands like, don't murder somebody else. Don't worship other gods. Don't commit adultery. Honoring the Sabbath is right there in equality with those. Therefore, we're saying, and as we've been trying to say as a community, that we want to take Jesus at his word, right? To trust in what he's saying for the fullness of life and who he's calling us to be. We need to take very seriously his call to take a Sabbath and to rest. And in fact, I'm just going to put it up there. It's fun to see. I have the Ten Commandments from the Exodus account, right? It's interesting that all of them are up there, and God wrote them all out, except for if you notice the fourth commandment, the one about Sabbath, actually takes up an entire paragraph, where all the others actually are just one sentence, and most of them, in fact, are just 4 words. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, and so on. It's like he knew something about human nature. He really was trying to get this into our heads. Hey, this is an important one for you. So we're all familiar. We talked about just have to shut down the technology and find a place of rest. No, it's totally fine. Totally fine. So you guys familiar with that concept of like a gateway drug, right? Like it's like a lesser drug. It's a gateway to harder and harder and more addictive stuff in your life. Well, I would say honestly, at least my experience has been that I would say of all sins, dishonoring the Sabbath is a gateway sin. I'm just being honest. If I look at my own life, if I look back at times where I've been off track in one area or the other, I was also sinning in this area as well. It almost goes hand in hand, not exclusively, but I truly see this as a potential massive gateway sin if there is such a thing. And I think that's because we are all made for the presence of God, right? We're made to be, as we're saying, in eternal, constant unity and relationship with our Creator. And the amazing thing about this Sabbath rhythm that he's established is that it is a constant rhythm of bringing us into his presence, and then that's where we recenter our lives on him. And when you're in the presence of God, right, when you're in the presence of light, he's bringing all your stuff to the light. You're finding yourself in his love, and therefore the darkness that's inside of you cannot exist. It cannot last when you're there and you're finding himself in your presence, in his presence. And when you're doing that on a weekly basis, it keeps you constantly coming into the light. So honoring Sabbath is actually a healing practice. It's not just about rest, though rest is important. Rest is a practical part of it. But it's an active rest in the presence of God. And it literally changes the way that you live. Right? It rewires your brain. It sets your heart right. I want to give this example of this idea of what it does to your heart in particular. So I was a gymnast growing up. I was training like 5 days a week and competing on weekends and stuff. And so it was really important, as your gymnast, you build up a lot of calluses on your hand. And I needed to keep these calluses in order to be effective at competition. And so I would protect them, I'd file them down, I'd do all these different things. But I couldn't get them wet because they would soften up. And so I never got to go in hot tubs. I never took baths. And even when I showered, I literally would shower with my hands outside like this and not get them wet. And then like quickly wash my hair right at the very end and then dry off my hands. Like it really protected these calluses because I didn't want them to get wet. But I think that's just like kind of an example in thinking about calluses and the way they work and the way they soften is what a lot of us end up doing with the state of our hearts, because we allow our hearts to stay calloused when we, week after week, skip the process of them being submerged in the Spirit. Right? We skip the process of them being in the water, which is representative of the Spirit. We skip services at church. We skip groups. We skip our own prayer time, our own time to just walk and reflect with the Lord. And whether that's out of just like we have a lot to get done, busyness, whether that means exhaustion, whether it means a complacency, it doesn't matter what we're doing, is we're missing out on the living water that's going to soften our hearts. It's going to soften the edges of our lives and our souls so that when the temptations of the enemy come in, which actually are meant to harm you and hurt you, if you're all calloused up, and you're going to be numb to the fact and to the sense that those are there to truly wound you. And Jesus makes it so clear time and again that this idea of rest, this idea of intentional, set-apart, holy time, what's called the Sabbath, was created by God for us as a gift. It's not like he had this set of rules that he just wants you to follow for the sake of you being obedient. He wants us all to be whole, and he wants us to be free and healed. He wants us to live life in all its fullness with him. As he says, Jesus himself, Sabbath was made for man. I made it for you as a gift, not man for the Sabbath. Sabbath is healing to our souls. And so there's a few ways I was just meditating on it this week that Sabbath is actually healing that I just want to throw out here. So honoring Sabbath is healing because it brings healing and health physically and mentally. I don't need to unpack that too much, right? We see that even scientifically and physiologically. You got to take a break. You got to rest. I know there's stories about how there was somebody at one time who tried to change the work week to a 10-day work week, and it just crashed and burned. It was a disaster. We were made for rest, right? We need to take a break. Honoring Sabbath also, though, bolsters our heart and it strengthens our faith. That is, like we said, it's a rhythm of binding yourselves to the life source of Jesus. Honoring Sabbath is also a testimony to those around us. Right? Our time is our testimony, what you're doing with your time, especially in the city. Choosing to just be a person of delight, like taking a whole day just to have a day of gratitude and delight and joy and not be productive, even though there's other stuff that could still be getting done, that is a massive testimony that you're putting your trust and you're putting Christ first in your life. And then again, that leads to honoring Sabbath being an affirmation that your trust and your dependence is on God and not in your own strength. Taking that day for God is a day to trust that productivity will take care of itself. That's a hard one, right? Affirms that we stand on the belief that God is our ultimate provider, not ourselves, not the things that we feel like we have to get done. So we need to develop this rhythm of rest in our life. And this rhythm of rest is a recharging. I just want to make that clear too. It's not just relaxing. We all know how to relax. And so you can binge out on TV and relax, but it's not necessarily restorative. So think it's more about renewal. So you have a cell phone and it's dead, it's exhausted, it's used up all its energy. You don't just toss it to the side for a while and let it chill out. You have to plug it into the power source. You get what I'm saying? Great. So here's a framework, I think, a little bit for us, and just the rest of our time. I'm just going to share like these four pillars that I think, because for some of us, maybe we understand Sabbath, but I think a lot of us don't fully understand what a day like this could actually look like and how it gets framed out. So I'm going to give these 4 ideas that I think are a healthy Sabbath for us. So first and foremost, we just need to stop. And I think that makes sense. It's super obvious, right, that that's a part of Sabbath, but I think that's where many of us get it wrong from the very get-go, that we just need to stop. Because if you're like me, most of us, when it comes to whatever that day off that's going to be your day off, is you have not yet accomplished and gotten done all the things that you need to get done, right? There's still projects that you're working on. There's still definitely work that you could be doing. There's emails. There's even just like social things you got to work out. There's a lot of obligations in this life. And it's not just a weekly thing. I want to point this out too, because I've seen this be an endless cycle, like that desire to just need to push through a little bit longer, especially in New York. So we get these people that get on this run of like a season in their life where I just have to push through. So I'm just going to give myself to this unhealthy lifestyle and a job for like 2 years, right? Because I'm trying to get to this next level as so-and-so in this industry. But then I'm going to get on track because I'll be at that next level. Or I just need to push through because I need the money in the immediate, and I'll just got to get through to the holiday season. Or I got to get through the holidays, or like once summer hits. And it becomes, for many of us, this season of like intentionally choosing to live in unhealth because you're trying to push through. But I think the problem with that is that what we're doing with that is we're actually still deceiving ourselves, as if that's something that you actually have the right and the capability to do. You can, but you're still functioning under this macro premise that you're in control of your own life, that actually favor and blessing and success will come to you by how hard you work and what you can accomplish. So it's like tied in again to that money conversation that we had last week, where the core spirit behind mammon is to put your trust in something other than God. And when we refuse to stop because we have too much to get done, we're actually putting our trust in ourselves and our own capabilities and not trusting that in and through honoring God that he will actually provide, that he will take care of us, that we truly do not need to worry about tomorrow because truly we cannot control tomorrow. Just stopping alone declares to us that God is God and that we are not, and that his ways are actually higher than our ways. It's about trust. Stopping is about trust, so we need to stop. Just a quick story here. Marva Dawn wrote about this in her book called On Sabbath. And she tells the story of a wagon train of Christians. So going from St. Louis actually to Oregon. So are you guys familiar with the Oregon Trail? It's very similar to this, I'm sure. Very similar to that experience. Okay, so they're on this journey in the fall from St. Louis to head to Oregon. And as it starts out, this group of Christians, right, they're honoring the Sabbath. They're stopping every, seventh day to rest, and they're continuing on this journey. Until they get a little further in the journey and they realize, man, winter is coming pretty quickly, and we are starting to get worried and anxious that we are not going to make it into Oregon until or before the snow sets in. And so there's a group of people that says, hey, I think it would be best for us, just for this season, to stop honoring the Sabbath and just push through and travel all 7 days a week. Now, not everybody actually agreed to this. Though, I'll be honest, I think that's just a classic example of justification that we all fall into because it actually makes logical sense, right? Winter is very dangerous. They have these little covered wagons, right? They have kids and livestock in these things. So I understand it even intellectually. But there was a disagreement. And so what happened is they actually divided. And one group went on and pressed through 7 days a week to get to Oregon as soon as possible. And another group continued to honor the Sabbath. And of course, I'm sharing this story when I'm talking about Sabbath. So as the story goes, right, the group that honored the Sabbath actually got to Oregon sooner. And not only that, they were significantly healthier. It turns out that those that honored the Sabbath found that both the people and the horses were healthy and rested and exponentially more effective the other 6 days of the week, as opposed to those that just pushed through. There's a spiritual component to it, but there absolutely also is just a natural and healthy rhythm to life that we were created for. So we got to stop. Then second, we need to rest. Our next aim is to actually rest, right? And we talked about this. We know what resting looks like. It's napping. It's taking a nice walk. But I want to just briefly talk about the mental game of resting as well. There's an intentionality to resting. And I'm terrible at this, right? That's why this one's huge for me, because my mind's always going. And so it's possible for me to take a couple, 2-3 days off even, and actually never really have rested. Because you actually, to truly rest, you need to replace certain things in your head and replace those with rest. And not just anything, but specific things. So I'm just going to give some examples from this, but I think you can play this out for yourself. But so for me, these are things that I need to eliminate. Some of these will be overlaps for you, right? So the first obvious one is work, right? I need to actually stop working and replace work with rest. But then the other one for me is multitasking, right? My mind, like I said, is always going. So I need to create a day and a time where I can just focus on the thing I'm doing in the present. It's actually a practice of presence, of being fully present. The other one is decision making. Neuroscience has actually revealed that decision fatigue is a real thing. And I make so many decisions during the week, I need a day where I don't need to make all kinds of decisions. I need a break. Here's a tough one. Catching up on errands. Okay, hear me on this one. It's tough for all of us, right? Life's busy and it's hard, and the city is a pain. Sabbath is not a day to just get things done that need to get done in your normal life. So it's not just a day off. We have a day off, but we're talking about one day a week where you don't need to do like the laundry and the cleaning and those extra errands. I think the reason a lot of us feel like we have to do that on our day off, and then what we end up doing is because they need to get done. Those are normal everyday life things. We all deal with those things. But many of us find that we need to rob our day off of time by doing those things, when really we need to look at the other 6 days of our life that we are living and realizing, how is it possible that I'm living these other 6 days in such a way that I'm so busy that I can't take care of the normal things of life, that I can't give myself one day off of rest. And then the last one is technology, right? And I don't have time to dive into that one. We could probably do an entire series on technology. But obviously, if it's about presence, if it's about being intentional and about honoring that moment that you're in, of course, technology, probably more than anything else, can distract you, can pull you into the life of work, can pull you into the life of temptation that can just numb you out for a while. So you need to protect yourself from that on that day off as well. The goal is to reorient your life in such a way that you can take care of these things in the other 6 days so that you can have a day of delight as a gift to yourself. And all of these things, like we said, take intentionality and they take preparation. So just one quick thing on preparation. Like we said, it's not organic. It's not going to just happen. Like preparation is necessary, just like anything. If you want to throw a great party or you want to go on a date or anything, like it takes preparation. So, for example, my wife and I enjoy cooking together, and on our Sabbath day, we wanted to cook together, so I found this like cinnamon roll recipe, because I'm a big sucker for cinnamon rolls. They turned out okay. They weren't that great, but whatever. But we had to prepare for that to happen so that we could wake up on our day off and, put on the music and get the coffee brewing and make this. I had to go out. I had to make sure we had coffee, first of all. I had to make sure in advance that when we woke up, all the ingredients to make cinnamon rolls were available and ready, because most of that stuff wasn't in our house. Like, it took preparation so that on the day of delight, on our Sabbath, we could actually enjoy, that we actually could step into that time. So there is a preparation and intentionality that is required in our lives to make this kind of thing possible. And then the third thing I want to talk about is it is a day of rejoicing, right? Rejoice. It should be fun. It's celebration. I always like to use that example of like a little kid on Christmas morning who's so excited to go and experience the Christmas morning with all the gifts that their parents have prepared for them and the great time and the traditions they're going to have with family. How great would that be if each week, like, we're looking forward to that day where we're going to enjoy the gifts and live life as if the kingdom has come and delight in the gifts of the Father and have a day of gratitude. And each day, and we end that day and it's like, oh, what a wonderful, great day, delighting in the Lord, and I can't wait for the next one. And before you know it, it's going to be there 6 days again. What a healthy lifestyle and way to live. Sabbath is a day to simply enjoy the gifts of God. So, and that's simple things for your life too, like play on this day. So like if you like to walk in the park, or if there's this cool restaurant you've been wanting to try out, like save it, make reservations for yourself on the Sabbath, on your day off. Or if there's a show you want to go see, or if you like to run. That would never be my thing. I'm not going to run on the Sabbath. But for some of you might like to go on a run, right? That's great. I love how Dan Allender, one more quote from him, he says it like this: the Sabbath is a day when the kingdom to come has come and is celebrated now rather than anticipated tomorrow. It's a fiction, a theater of a divine comedy that practices eternity as a present reality rather than a future state. Sabbath is not about time off or a break in routine. It's not a mini vacation to give us a respite so we're better prepared to go back to work. The Sabbath is far more than a diversion. It is meant to be an encounter with God's delight. The Sabbath mimics God's response on the seventh day. Certainly, he was not tired from his busy creational enterprise. If we need to get downtime or chill, then we should use another day and not the Sabbath. In fact, if we enter the Sabbath with joy, then it will spill its abundance into the other 6 days. The Sabbath is the kind of delight that leads to life. And then lastly, the fourth one is reflect, which, full confession, I just made it reflect so that it had another R in there, so that I had the 3 R's, right? But it could be anything. It could be dwell. It could be immerse. So I'm not talking about just reminiscing. I'm talking about entering into the presence of God, about reflecting on God, like spending that time. That should actually be an active part of that day as well. And not just in the quiet prayer time. So if you're just envisioning like this amazing like prayer and worship time, that'd be a great thing to have on your Sabbath. But also to carry his presence with you and the awareness of him throughout your day. So on that walk in the park, as you go out to this fantastic restaurant, to carry and dwell on the presence of God, to reflect on the things he's doing in and through your life and the world around you. A day to listen to his voice and to thank him and to rest in his presence. So again, I'm going to close out here, but those 4 pillars, right? We said stop, first of all, then rest, rejoice, and reflect. And you can simply begin by thinking of centering your Sabbath around those things. But even if for you, like this is so new to you, you're like 4 is still too many, I'll just give you 2. Just pray and play. Pray and play. Just start there. Start intending a day that you pray and play, and you center that day on praying and playing. Take a day to rest and recharge, and I promise you it will change your life. It will change your life. It is so simple, and yet it is one of the most difficult things, and it's one of the most cheated on of the commandments that God gives us. And yet it is ingrained into the fabric of who we were created to be. Isaiah 58 is a prophecy that, again, the Lord is speaking again about the Sabbath. And he says this: if you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own way and not doing as you please or speaking idle words, then you will find your joy in the Lord. And I will cause you to ride in triumph on the heights of the land and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. And so as we reflect on that, I also want us to take a moment again to bring it back to that first question of just how are you doing? How are you doing? And in that, even reflect. Have you stopped to reflect on how delicate life is? Right? No matter how stacked your resume is, or how successful you are, or how put together your household is, or how well mapped out you are for the next coming weeks or months, that we actually don't have control of the breath in our lungs and the beating of our own hearts. That our actual joy is found in the Lord, and he's inviting us to step into his presence. He's saying, I want to soak you and fill you. I want to soften your edges. I want to soften your heart. I want you to be a carrier of my Holy Spirit into this world. I want you to delight in my presence. I want to give you joy and fullness of life. I want you to be able to fall down at my feet and to bring all your burdens to me. And not just every once in a while, but on a regular basis. I am here for you. Psalm 34 says, taste and see that the Lord is good. Oh, the joys of those who take refuge in him. Active rest, Sabbath, time to delight, rejoice, and reflect on God. That is what we are longing for, because that's what God is inviting us into. So just take some time to pray, and then we're going to respond. Father, we're so thankful for the way that you love us, that you know us even better than we know ourselves. God, I even sense that some of us, like we know this and we sense this, God, but I just pray over us, Lord, that you do a work in our heart, Lord, that we want to create space for you. And as audacious as that even sounds, right, that we, mere humans, are creating space for the creator of the universe. But God, may we be a people that walks away from your word and remembers what is said and starts to make it a practice in our life. Like those things that rise up in us that are saying, oh yeah, I need to do this, or I have to do this, or I understand and I will have that, but I have this. God, would you just break us of those things? Would you break us of the addiction of busyness? Would you break us of the addiction, even more so, of feeling like we need to accomplish everything or we're not going to be okay? May we grow in our trust of you. Would you raise the level of faith in our hearts tonight, God? Lord, we honor you and we worship you with our attention and with our hearts. In your name, amen.